after looking at Nahum, preaching a difficult prophet. We want to think about some kind of creative, thoughtful ideas in terms of, okay, so how do you actually do that? The standard is just don't. Avoid the prophets and don't preach the prophets, and then you don't have the problem. But assuming that we believe kind of what I suppose Andy said the other day, that we want to preach the whole counsel of God. Right? And if we take a massive chunk of the Bible like the prophets and then just don't ever preach from it, how can we be preaching the whole counsel of God? And if we believe 2 Timothy 3:16 that all scripture is God-breathed and is useful, then of course we want to preach the prophets. But then the temptation is to just go to the easy stuff always. So yeah, what would be the kind of the easy ones? Where do you sort of think of as easy access prophets? Some parts of Isaiah, yeah. So for example, chapter 40 or 53 or 6 or 9. Well, 9 in its context is quite hard, but yeah. Ezekiel 37, yeah, that's very popular, isn't it? Some bones, what? Yeah, the New Covenant bit of Jeremiah. Haggai's nice, isn't it? I love Haggai. 4 oracles, 2 chapters, quite applicable. That's like a good weekend, youth group type of thing, yeah. Huh? Hosea 1-3. But once you get past Hosea 1-3, 4 to the end is a little bit more, what's the structure, what's happening there? But people like the story of the start of Hosea. What about Daniel? 1-6, right? And skipping 2. And so it does seem like we sort of pick and choose, don't we? And I've spoken at a church once, and they asked me to speak on Daniel chapter 2, verses 1-17 or something. And I thought, I'm pretty sure you're not giving someone else the second half. And so I contacted them and asked them, what's happening the week before and the week after? It was chapter 1, it was chapter 3. I said, okay, so I can do the whole of 2 then. So I preached the whole chapter, and they were fine with it. But it helped me realize, okay, they're doing a series on the narratives of Daniel. They really don't want to touch the big program apocalyptic stuff. But the reality is that the setting matters, and so to just have a kind of hard, I preach the whole counsel of God, and then you've got a whole load of brand new Christians or non-Christians, and you take 6 years to work through Ezekiel, probably isn't very helpful for them. Or any church, and it's Christmas time or it's Easter time, and guests are coming, and you just keep on going through Zechariah or something. Zechariah could work for Easter, but do you know what I mean? Like something that seems obscure, it probably isn't the right thing for the right time. But if over the course of 5 years you haven't touched the prophets, then they're missing out. And so I think we need to, appropriately balance, but balance doesn't mean perfect balance. There will be more New Testament, I think, than Old Testament, generally speaking, in a church. But I don't like it when people say, we only preach the New Testament, we're a New Testament church. I'm like, oh, you're very impoverished. The Old Testament's not just there as a collection of obscure illustrations. It's revelation of God's heart and character. And so we want to, not only for the sake of the teaching that we do on a Sunday, but also for the sake of people's own reading and personal feeding during the week. If they never hear us touch the Old Testament, they're probably skipping it too. And so Old Testament narratives, Psalms, prophets. It's interesting, actually, in our church, we probably have three quarters, 75% New Testament. That's my kind of guess looking back. It's not a planned thing, but when people talk about series they remember, it's always the Old Testament ones. In Life of Abraham, Life of Jacob, we just did last year, Book of Daniel, some of the Psalms stuff, some of the prophets. Those are the ones that people really go, ooh, that was really, because it's new. It feels different and fresh, whereas the familiar Gospels, Acts, Epistles stuff, maybe it doesn't grab them in the same way. So yeah, I agree. Be aware of your situation. Don't just say, right, we've got to do a prophet. it might not be the right thing at this time in your church, and some prophets may be better than others. And so that's kind of why we have to decide what we're feeding our congregation. But as an overall principle, we want to preach the whole counsel. But evaluate that over the course of several years, not, okay, we had a message from a gospel last week, we must do Old Testament this week, otherwise we're not balanced. Just watch your series and watch your flow. If you're in a church where you do series that, like Andy described, take months and months and months, then figure out if you're going to break into that series, don't break into it from the same book. If you've got 15 months going through the Gospel of Mark, and then you have a Sunday, like a baptism or something that's a standalone, don't preach it from a gospel. Go somewhere else, In our church, we keep our series much shorter because I think every new series is an opportunity for new energy. And so I'd rather have new energy every month or two instead of next February. Some considerations for preaching a difficult prophet. And some of this would apply to anything in the Bible as well. But in my mind, I'm thinking difficult prophet. Nahum, for example. Zephaniah. Something that people are unfamiliar with. Something that isn't an easy one. The easiest minor prophets or the most familiar, what would those be? We mentioned Hosea. Jonah. Because we have it as a story. So as a narrative, Jonah is familiar. Doesn't mean that it's easy to preach it. You still got to work hard on how you preach it, but no one's surprised if you preach Jonah. Zechariah? That's easy?
No, sorry.
Okay. Like, wow, that's intimidating. Zechariah is a challenging one, yeah. Malachi's kind of nice because it's this sequence of about 7 burdens that have a similar structure, and so it's very preachable, quite a punch in the face, but it's doable. Habakkuk is another one that people tend to have heard because it's got that nice structure, question, answer statement, and it's like this back and forth between God and the prophet. And so the first ones that come to my mind are, what have I heard in churches? Habakkuk, Jonah. Okay, and then I haven't heard Malachi much, maybe because it's hard content, even if it's straightforward structure. But yeah, so there are some that may be... Joel? Oh, it gets mentioned, yeah, but preached as a whole book, I've not heard it, apart from when I've done it. I like it. So, in terms of, first of all, series length. Okay, let's think about how, if you've got a minor prophet, okay, and this would apply to the majors too, but especially with a minor prophet, don't assume that there is a standard length that you have to take with a prophet. Don't think 3 chapters, okay, that's a 3-week series. 6 chapters, that's going to be a 6-week series. Is there a 6-chapter one? Anyway, 7 like Micah. Does that have to be 7 weeks? No. We don't have to have that habit of just going chunk. Haggai doesn't have to be 4 messages. Okay, so we've got flexibility in terms of how we create the length of preaching plan with a prophet. So it could be a single sermon. You could do Jonah in 1 message. You could do Hosea in 1 message. That's a stretch, but you can do it. You can do Isaiah in 1 message. Obviously, once you get bigger, you're not covering all the text. But you've got to grasp the whole and figure out what you're communicating to give a sense of the whole in a single message. So I'm not saying, okay, you've got a 5, 6, 7 chapter book and you're going to pluck 1 verse and preach it. That's not what I mean. I mean preach the message of the book in a single message. It's actually quite a good challenge for us as preachers. If you're a regular preacher, that's not a bad idea to do several, do a whole bunch of them. I remember doing a series in Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai. Just bang, 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 one after the other. And that went so well. People loved that because I'm getting a grip of the whole book. And obviously it takes a lot of work to sort of condense and communicate, but it can be done. Okay, so you can do single sermon. You can do a short series. If you're in the habit of having 8-month series, it's okay to have a 3 or 4 week series. People might actually like it, sort of bite-sized and manageable. It could be an uneven series. What do I mean by uneven? You don't have to have every text length be the same in a series. Okay, so you could have 2 or 3 that are kind of similar, but then you may have one that's on a 3-verse section because it's really significant. And then you may have one that's on 4 chapters. And so you go, hang on, that's half a chapter, half a chapter, half a chapter, 2 verses, 4 chapters. That's not even. No, it's not, but who cares? It's up to you. You're the preacher. So you organize the material and figure out how you want to handle it. You could, if you're doing a longer one, have a midpoint where you're surveying what you've seen already. Or you could come to the end of a series and do one message where you recapitulate the whole book in one message. Instead of just finishing with the final words, say, okay, this is what we've seen. Obviously, you've got to think through, how do I not sound like I'm just reviewing and I haven't done any work? You've got to make it have its own life. Sometimes you can go first person for something like that to make it definitely different, where you're acting as the prophet or as someone from the time or something. We'll talk about that in a second. But don't think of series as automatically you put the book into the machine, press the button, and it just falls out in equal-sized chunks. Okay, you decide. I could imagine a Hosea series, for example, that might have chapters 1, 2, and 3 either as one message or 2 or 3 messages, whatever, to tell that story. And then chapters 4 to 11 may be treated thematically, because there's really 3 themes that are working their way through that, where you might go one theme, another theme, another theme. Okay, that's very different. But you've got to look at the book, grasp the book as best you can, and then decide what's the best way, what's the most effective way to do this. And the benefit of kind of not just having standard chunks is that it will change the preaching a bit and make it a bit more interesting. Otherwise, it can start to sound like, I don't remember, was that week 4 or week 2 or week 3? Basically, every week's the same. I can't remember. If everything's always the same, it can sort of send people to sleep. And so be creative. You can also combine creatively, sort of thematically linking Zephaniah and Joel, both Day of the Lord prophets. And so you could do something like that, or geographically with Nahum and Jonah. Why not have these 2 together in a series? So in terms of series, think about it. Be creative. Down to the specific message now. Let's think about some of those things. We've sort of said this one already, but set the scene, help people to understand the historical context, but don't overwhelm them with detail. Okay, and that's more tempting when you're in a more obscure situation, like Nahum. Okay, but the challenge, I suppose, is this, that in your study, if you've properly studied Nahum and you've really been getting into the books and reading and you've done your work in the text, you've gone into the commentaries, it's probably, hopefully, become a delight to you and kind of wow, this is amazing. But when you stand up and start listing Assyrian kings and giving historical background about Ashurbanipal and Ashur-dan III and all this kind of stuff, people kind of go, ooh, not really listening. And there's a disconnect between your hours and hours of growing awareness and your listeners who are sat there thinking, sorry, what part of the world are we in? When? What part of history? So you kind of got to remember they're brand new to it. And so maybe all they need to know is that here's Judah, Assyria was the global superpower, and this is what it was like. Maybe that's all they need to be able to engage with what you're saying. And then there may be the odd detail in the text that needs a little bit of extra explanation. But what they probably don't need is a 15, 20-minute lecture on Assyrian politics and history and quotes from the Assyria Times that you found online. It's not all necessary. So as much as necessary, as little as possible is probably the way to go with historical stuff. Okay? Number 3, demonstrate how to benefit without understanding every detail. I feel that when I'm preaching prophets, I feel the responsibility to understand every detail myself as best I can. I'm not saying that we can just ignore stuff. In our study, get to grips with everything you possibly can. What does that phrase mean? What is that referring to? Who's the you there? Like, we've got to know our way around a Bible book as well as we can. I remember one of my teachers at Bible school, he was kind of on the way to retirement because he had Parkinson's. And so I had him once just at the end, and he was obviously fading. But he was a powerful preacher in his time. But he said he would never preach any message until he'd read the book 50 times. And so you read Nahum 50 times and then start studying and then preach it, you probably understand what's going on. That's a good principle, right? But that doesn't mean that the listener has to understand every detail in order to benefit from your message. And in fact, if you end up explaining every detail, as well as it going long, they will get the impression, I could never benefit from that book if I wasn't with you. And that's not a compliment. If someone comes up to you and says, thank you so much for preaching, can I come and sit with you when I'm doing my quiet time? That's not a compliment. That's a problem, right? Actually, you want them to read the Bible without you. You don't want them saying, the Bible's too difficult, I'm just going to wait till next week because you're great. Makes your ego feel good, but actually you want them reading the Bible tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. What are they going to do if they don't have access to the books that helped you finally figure out the weird figure of speech in verse 18? And so sometimes I will study something and have a whole load of information, but then when I'm working out my message, I'm saying, okay, what's my main point? What's my big idea here? Is explaining that detail necessary for the big idea? And so actually sometimes when I'm preaching it, I might selectively read and not even read something that's potentially just going to confuse people. Sometimes I'll read something and say, lots of detail there. Let's not worry about it. Let's keep moving. Keep in mind what we're seeing. And so sometimes I'll sort of reduce the focus on something complex, even though as a Bible student, I'm fascinated by it. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, I think to do that with integrity, it's better, much better, for me to actually have an explanation if I'm pushed. If someone comes up afterwards and says, sorry, I'm really bothered by that verse 18 thing. What is that about? If I then go, I have no idea, I haven't got a clue, then it kind of undermines my message. But if I can say, let's sit down and talk about it, sometimes things need 15 minutes and you didn't have that in the sermon. Do you see what I'm saying? So if your listeners can say, yeah, there's definitely stuff in that I didn't understand, but wow, the whole thing was, the whole chunk that we were looking at had an impact on me, I think that's good. So don't think, well, that's complicated, we can't touch the whole book, or we can't touch the section. Sometimes you just demonstrate that it's possible to enjoy the Bible and to benefit without understanding everything, while at the same time giving the sense that actually it's better if you can. So you don't want to sort of take the pressure off completely, but the pressure's not all on you every time you're preaching. Number 4, don't always preach a prophet directly. Okay, so what I mean by that is, don't read the passage and then hit people with it. So classic example, I heard once about a preacher who spoke at a midweek women's Bible study, midweek during the day, which means they're all 75, 80, 90, 106, that kind of crowd, and he was preaching Ezekiel 34, and he rebuked them for being evil shepherds. That's stupid, all right? Now, doesn't mean he shouldn't preach Ezekiel 34 because it's an old women's group, but maybe point it in a different direction because none of them are shepherds. None of them are leaders in the workplace or leaders in the church or whatever. It's a dear gathering of faithful prayer warriors, probably. And so it doesn't make sense to rebuke them with it, even though that's what the text is doing. And so that's a case where you go, okay, how do I preach that to them? That I don't know why you would, but if you, let's say that they've asked you, can you preach Ezekiel 34? Okay. How do you do that? Here is the situation. Ezekiel to the leaders of Israel. He's rebuking them. Isn't it interesting? Not very good. Okay. What's in it for us? Just historical fascination generally is not enough. Even though we are historically fascinated, our listeners generally aren't. So what's the point of connection? Well, prayer for your leaders, appreciation of your leaders not being like that, confidence that God's going to judge your leaders if they are like that. There's a whole load of messages that you could give to a group of old, saints from a passage that is a stern rebuke, but they don't need to have it. And Nahum's the example of that in a way, isn't it? Because Nahum himself is preaching a message at Nineveh, but standing on the walls of Jerusalem. Who's listening to him? It's not the Ninevites, is he? He hasn't got like a press conference there with the Nineveh Herald taking notes. He's shouting in the direction of Nineveh so that the people in Jerusalem can hear him. And so his anger towards Nineveh is a comfort for them. And that's kind of an example for us. When we're preaching to people, we don't have to go, well, the text says it, I better preach it. Bam! What do you do if you've got Malachi and you're preaching to a church that is incredibly generous and is just giving sacrificially, and people are foregoing vacations and driving a 55-year-old car in order to give to the building project of the church? You don't want to be saying to them, test me in this, says the Lord. Give your tithes properly and see if I don't. Like, they don't need beating up. They're already doing it. So you can take a rebuke and communicate it as an encouragement. Okay, and so either in a direct way, or this is what was going on back then, here's how we access it. So that's another angle to keep in mind. We don't want to sort of either be scared of the prophets because they're fiery. Oh, I'm not fiery. I couldn't possibly preach a prophet. That's not the point. But equally, you don't want to say, well, I am fiery, so I'm just going to preach prophets. Even if you're fiery, your people may not need it. We do need to think about, number 5, a more engaging presentation. Not every time. Sometimes just a straightforward, plain, standard sermon can do exactly what's needed. But there are possibilities with creativity. Andy mentioned a few the other day, like having the chair kind of representing the person or nation being judged and putting himself in the chair. That kind of use of a prop can be really effective, really memorable. I've mentioned first person already. That's an option. I know for some of you think that's not an option. I'm never going to do that. Not a chance. What I would say, especially after last night, what I would say is you don't have to dress up. All right? Yeah. I mean, last night is fine. I'm not criticizing it at all. But that's not a model you have to copy in order to preach first person. Okay? If you are going to go first person, you need to really think through a few things. Okay? So first of all, you've got to do all the work in the text anyway. So all your standard work still has to happen. Plus, there's lots of things going on, but it's all the normal work of a sermon plus a whole load of extra work. You've got to know the geography better. You've got to know the details without having to look. You can't be doing it from notes. Like, there's all sorts of additional factors. And then I would say costume generally is distracting. It tends to become entertaining in a costume, whereas if you are just portraying a character in your normal clothing, no one giggles in the same way. You come in with a fake beard, no one's listening, they're just laughing. All right? Pretending to be something bizarre, I couldn't do a first person as Zacchaeus, right? He was short. Like, no one is going to be able to listen to me acting like I'm Zacchaeus and take it seriously. It's just distracting. I might be able to do Goliath, but I cannot do Zacchaeus, I can't play the part of like a court jester. It's just not my temperament. And so if I pretend to be a court jester, someone who's kind of doing cartwheels and juggling, do you know what I mean? It just doesn't communicate, it doesn't work. So you've got to kind of be appropriate to the character that you're playing in the sermon. But then the thing that you want to think about is that simply being that person is not interesting enough. Okay, there still needs to be a storyline. There still needs to be tension and resolution. If it's just a recounting of what happened, the interest of you pretending to be a person fades after about 2 minutes. And you've got to sustain it for 20 or 30 minutes. It still needs to be a sermon that grips people. Do you see what I mean? So it's an option, but it's not an easy one. I've probably done 5, 6 first persons in 20 years. I just don't do them very often. But I do mention them because they can be really effective. Haddon Robinson, who was my teacher, his son, Tory Robinson, really loves first person. And his church, which at least back when I knew of them, was in Harlem, a really rough background, low education levels. The congregation just loved a first person sermon. They were gripped by it. But he discovered he could only do it about once in 8 weeks because he just couldn't generate the energy, couldn't do the extra work. So he'd do 7 normal sermons and then a first person, and that's way more than I've ever done. The one that I've done, that if you said to me, what's the most effective first person you've ever done? Nahum. And I did it because I was stuck. Okay, I committed to preaching Nahum. The church leaders had said, oh, Nahum, great, we've never heard on that. Go for it. So it's in the schedule, Peter's preaching Nahum. I got to about the Thursday, and I'd studied it, and I'd figured out who the yous were and who the king of Nineveh was, and I'd made sense of it. I was like, how do I preach this? It's just negative, isn't it? Like you got chapter 1, verse 7 and 1, verse 15. Everything else is judgment. And I was really wrestling with it. Like, this is going to be dull. It's going to be like this lecture. It's going to be, and I was really feeling stuck. And then I thought I could go first person. And by going first person, it allowed me to bring people in a more vivid way into the situation. So then my question was, okay, do I act as if I'm there then? Or do I act as if I'm Nahum now? If I bring people back then, that can work, but it felt difficult with Nahum because it's a whole context they wouldn't understand, and how could they be there without understanding it? If it was a David and Goliath one, maybe, we're in the camp and it's just over there. Can you hear the voice? Like that can work because people sort of know the story. With Nahum, I thought, no, I've got to come to today. And so I forget, there's no costume weirdness or anything like that, but I just launched straight in and said, it's a real privilege to be with you. My name's Nahum, and I've been invited by your elders to come and speak with you today. I've been here for a few days just trying to get used to all the things that have changed in the world, and very confusing. But on the first evening, Ian, one of the elders there, Ian sat me down. He said, hey, we're privileged to have you here. Welcome. I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is your book made it into the Bible. I said, really? What's the Bible? And he explained it to me. And then I said, well, what's the bad news? He said, the bad news is no one ever reads it. And so he's asked me to share with you why it's worth reading. And so let me explain. And so I kind of preached as Nahum, a little bit of humor at the start, because I was like, there's nothing coming. This humorous. And then it was kind of into it. But to be able to say to people, you've got to understand, the people that were hearing what I was saying were the people that needed to know that God is in charge. Imagine an enemy that, and so I kind of did that whole, I'm preaching to them, but can you hear me thing? And then I kind of referred to bits and read bits and explained it as I was going. And everyone was like, oh, this is great. And afterwards, everyone was really thankful. It just worked super well. I even did it again at another thing because I was like, wow, that worked better than I expected. I was trying to survive, and it ended up being quite a good sermon. But the people were like, wow, that's great. I mean, it's so interesting you chose to do it that way and all that kind of stuff. I was like, I did it because I was panicking. I did it because I could not figure out how to make it effective in a normal form. So first person is an option, but don't overdo it. Don't act in the sense of don't put on a false voice. I tried to listen to a sermon once where someone was acting as Samson. And he did the whole thing with this really big. I was like, oh, stop it. After a minute, I just turned it off. I was like, sorry, Lord, I can't cope with that. It's driving me nuts. You know, you don't want to play the part of a eunuch and go all squeaky for the whole thing. Like, that would be distracting. Obviously, don't think it's only for youth. It's an obvious thing that you think, oh yeah, youth group would love that. Youth are quite hard because they can laugh quite easily, but adults can handle it, even if they're not used to it. They can cope. Just make sure that you're very biblical and you make the point. You've got to figure out how to apply the point, which is hard because it's not your world if you've entered into theirs. So either it's got to be generic or you step into your own, back into yourself for the final few minutes or something. So you've got to think through everything. Don't think that because I'm pretending to be Nahum, everything's going to be great. That'd be awful. You've got to really have a sermon and you've got to really preach it, okay? And then, what was I going to say as well? Yeah, adults can handle it. Formal churches can handle it, but be aware of the setting. Funerals can't handle it, all right? You wouldn't do it in a church when they're grieving because somebody just died. Like it would feel tone deaf, okay? So be alert to that. But there's other things you can do. Remember what Andy did with Amos 1 and 2 with the map? Preaching Amos 1 and 2, thinking of it as a map progression, either on a screen, kind of the progression, Damascus, Ammon, Moab, Edom, kind of working around and then getting to us. That works really well in a sermon if people get that sense of it's getting closer, it's getting closer. And so one way to do that is with a map on a screen. Another way could be like we're on a map, and so depending on the size of your church. If your church was this size, and in a room this size, would be quite nice, wouldn't it? You could, I can't because I'm not allowed to move, but you could kind of preach the parts related to the places from the places and have people like have the feeling of where is he now? And they're getting the circle around, so allowing the map to sort of do some of the work. That's a way. Memory aids, things like gesture walkthrough things, that's more of a teaching aid than a sermon aid, but there's potential there. Props like the chair or something, be creative. Don't feel like either I must preach as if I'm preaching Romans, or like Andy said, I must be naked lying on my side for 2 years. You don't have to go to weird extremes. You don't have to go bury your belt in order to be creative, but you can do stuff like that. It's kind of attention grabbing. Smashing a clay pot is generally distracting, but it could be perfect. There's things you can do. Number 6, see if there is another way in. What I mean by that is one way into a book is just introduce and then go into the book, all right? Another way in could be through the Old Testament historical background. So with Jonah, I didn't mention it, but Jonah's mentioned in Kings. We could have started with the story of Jonah in Kings because it does actually affirm him as a genuine prophet. That just brief story. Could even do a message on that to do all the biographical stuff week 1 and then start Jonah 1 the following week. It's a different way of handling it. If you want to argue it's not the same Jonah, I think you're struggling because it's the same dad as well. So that's a bit awkward. But so coming in through, it's like doing an epistle starting in Acts. Sort of setting the scene. That's one way in. Another way might be to do something that's almost obvious, but not necessarily natural, if you are of the opinion that the Bible progresses from Genesis to Revelation, rather than everything should be read through the lens of the New Testament. Some of us are trained to think purely New Testament backwards. Some of us have been trained to think, no, hang on, it progresses. Don't jump there too soon. That's more the way I think. But actually, when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, that might be a way to go into something obscure. So New Testament quoting of Nahum, not too many. Romans 10:15, I think, is maybe it. But that might be a place to start. Once you kind of see how significant what's being said in Romans is, why is he using this obscure prophet that no one talks about? Let's go look at it. But then what I would say is don't import a sort of Romans reading of Nahum. Let Nahum be Nahum. He didn't have Romans. So you can use it as a way in, but it doesn't control how you handle it. Okay. Number 7, I think we should keep in mind, and this could have gone as point 1, remember the theological constants. Sometimes you get so caught up in the detail of a difficult prophet and trying to make sense of different kingdoms and kings and dates and places and maps and stuff, you can get lost in it. Remember, it's going to help your preaching, some basic theological realities. Number 1, the Bible is a revelation of the character and heart of God. So even if you don't know any of the place names and you don't know who the people are, you can usually get a sense of how God's character is being revealed, his faithfulness or his jealousy or his judgment or his grace or whatever. So that's primary. So be looking for the character and the heart of God. So the Bible is a revelation of the character and heart of God. Secondly, to sinners and sufferers in a fallen world. And so as obscure as an audience may have been for a prophet, they were just sinners and sufferers in a fallen world, just like we are. Okay, the specifics may have been Assyria's way of doing battle and their particular forms of torture and terrorism and so on. And we may not be dealing with that in the same way, although I use the word terrorism, so maybe, but it may feel very far removed. But those people were sinners and sufferers in a fallen world, and so are we. And so there's a connection there that we can always relate to what we're looking at in some form. But we need to help people see that. Oppressive regimes, enemies, people that want you dead, people that are taking advantage of you, people that are building their own empires while crushing yours. I mean, there's constants. We just got to figure out how to frame it so that people can connect with it. So we've got the Bible as a revelation of God to sinners and sufferers in a fallen world, and specifically in reference to the issue of judgment. While it may be uncomfortable to our culture, we do not want a world without judgment. Right? It's not a better world with no judgment. We had a woman in our church for several years who never quite got it. She thought she was a Christian. I don't think she was. And my wife was texting with her every day. They were sharing Bible reading notes. Like they were kind of making a page of notes in response to their Bible reading and sharing them. And my wife was trying to help her. And one of the things that she just could not see was how judgment could ever be legitimate. How could we see that there's sin? No, everybody's sin is just it can be explained by their trauma, by their history. We've got to be understanding, we've got to be caring. And so I was putting things into my sermons like Solzhenitsyn quotes, the line between good and evil runs through the human heart. And I was dropping stuff in for, the whole church, but I hope she heard that. And, we kept going on that. And I'd say things like, it's not just Hitler that's evil. There's been evil all the way through history. And there's evil in the world today, and people are being hurt, and people are being taken advantage of, and there's bad stuff that's happening. And we may want to pretend that it isn't, and we may want to pretend that we can just be happy and explain it away. But ultimately, it's a comfort to know that there will be justice. It's a comfort to have a God who says, I will judge, I will avenge, and no sin will go unpunished. And that's so counter the kind of nice culture. You know what I mean? And she was just a fruit of a very nice culture and some background issues in her life and some other things. And it was like, oh, come on, you've got to see this. You do not want a world where there's no judgment. That becomes desperately dangerous, desperately confused, and desperately hopeless. And so actually the prophets, where they are difficult, they tend to be talking about judgment stuff. And therefore we tend to avoid the judgment stuff. But actually, theologically, people need to know that there is justice. But you've got to figure out ways to communicate it. Okay, so sometimes a very obscure burden against Tyre or something, it may not be the issues of Tyre specific that are what you need. It's just the reality that God speaks and promises to bring justice in a world that's profoundly broken and hurting. Okay, so yeah, God's being revealed, sinners and sufferers then and now. It may be uncomfortable, but we want God to judge. We don't want God to judge us, obviously, but praise the Lord, he's taking care of that too. And then last of all, then we can chat whatever minutes we have left, which isn't many. There are different ways to shape the sermon. So your sermon shape doesn't have to be identical every time. Okay, so the default, I would say, is let the text shape the sermon. If the text has a question and an answer, then your sermon should have a question and an answer. If the text has 3 reasons why, then preach 3 reasons why. If your text has a big presentation of something followed by a couple of examples, then why not have a big presentation of that thing with a couple of examples? Like the text can shape your message. And some preaching teachers totally agree with what I've just said, and some would be squirming in their seats. I remember taking one class, and we were in groups, and we were asked to put the outline of our message on the board. And I came up for my group, and I put the outline up, and the teacher said, no, you can't do that. Those points aren't parallel. You've got to have them parallel. And I said, but they're not parallel in the text. He said, I don't care about the text. I'm talking about the outline. I said, well, that's where you differ from Haddon, because I was trained by Haddon, and we reflect the text. And so I had a good conversation with him. It wasn't confrontational or anything, but I heard his point, but his point was according to the rules of rhetoric. And I was saying, yeah, but according to the text. And now he's a thoroughly biblical preacher, but he's constrained by the rules in a way that I don't feel constrained by the rules. If there's a major point and a minor point, I don't need to make them weighted equally. I can make them imbalanced. Okay, so the default, as far as I'm concerned, is reflect the text. But there's other options. There's other ways, things to think about. There may be within the scope of the passage a historical problem that has been solved within the passage. So maybe you want to have a problem solution, even if that means taking the text in a different way or whatever. So problem solution outline, you could have a contemporary concern addressed. So you could introduce with a contemporary issue and then find the answer back in the text. And so your introduction may be all today before you even get to the passage. Okay, so that can be slightly different. You can go biographical in terms of shaping it with the prophets. Obviously, we've got to keep in mind that the goal is to preach the text, not to preach a biography. But sometimes the biography is a way in. It's a way of shaping and organizing, so we can use that. I think it's possible to theologically shape your message or a series. So the foundational questions. What is God like? What does it mean to be a human? What's our problem? What's the solution? I did a series in the book of Acts where I used those 4, and I ended up, I think I preached Acts 17 for the first 2, and then Acts 15, and then Acts something else. So I was using speeches. So the shape of my series was 4 theological questions that are foundationally important. But I wasn't using Acts to say that. I was recognizing that's what they were saying in Acts, and then I was bringing that out. So, if you're in Isaiah, something big like that, you might take some of the great themes of Isaiah, the glory of God, the sinfulness of humanity, the grace of God, and the hope of the kingdom. Those are the big 4 themes in Isaiah. You might take those as 4 messages and choose your passages accordingly. So it's different ways, different approaches.